I hope you enjoyed lunch. It was the Virginia version of an Italian meal. There was no wine served, but that'll be available to you this evening, so we hope to make up for that then. I'm really excited about the next phase of our gathering. We have two people who are going to share with us what I think is just a remarkable journey. Most of you have seen the new book, Our Towns, 100,000-mile journey into the heart of America, which I think is a great title for this book. It's a book that, for me, was a great source of hope and inspiration at a time when we see mostly conflict and anger out of many of our political leaders, national political leaders. Here we get a picture of what's actually going on in the country. And it's brought to us by two people that have each had amazing careers. Jim Fallows has been writing and reporting for 43 years on not just what's going on in America, but what's going on all over the world. He was, for many years, he was the national correspondent for The Atlantic. He became their first, head of their first global bureau in London. He's very perceptive, and sometimes he's even prescient. He sees ahead of where the rest of us see. That's allowed him or caused him to win National Book Award, the American Book Award, the National Magazine Award. His books include China Airborne, Postcards from Tomorrow Square, Blind in Baghdad, and Breaking the News. He's also done a documentary series on China called On the Front Lines, Doing Business in China, which got an Emmy in 2010. That's all amazing enough, but along the way, he's been a software designer for Microsoft, a speechwriter for Jimmy Carter, an editor of U.S. News and World Report, and he's, as is critical to understanding the book, he's an instrument-rated private pilot. He's also the chair of the U.S. media U.S. media at the U.S. Studies Center at the University of Sydney in Australia. Deb Fallows should be an instrument-rated co-pilot for all of her time sitting in the other seat, and knowing when to engage in conversation and when not to engage in conversation. If you're on instrument flight rules, you learn very, very quickly when to be in and when to be out. She wrote a wonderful book called Dreaming in Chinese, a book that O Magazine called captivating. Her approach to studying China allowed her to understand many of the idiosyncrasies that confound the West in interacting with the Chinese. She got a PhD in linguistics from Harvard. She wrote another book that's kind of in some ways at the other end of the extreme, A Mother's Work, which deals with child rearing in the working mom age. She's most recently been doing research and polling for the Pew Internet Project. She writes on women, education, work, travel. She's appeared in the Atlantic Monthly, National Geographic, Newsweek, and other publications. Please join me in welcoming Jim and Deb Fallows to our stage.
Thank you so much, Carl. So I think we'll sit here. We'll talk initially just sitting down. So I am Jim of the Jim and Deb combo. This is Jim. We are so excited and honored to be here. We're grateful to Carl and to Clark and to Ted and to Lori of the Danville Regional Foundation and to all of you for coming from your communities around the region, around the country. So Deb and I have been, what we're going to talk to you about initially before we join you all in discussion is things we have seen over the past 4 or 5 years that coincide with the work that you all are doing and the ways in which the patterns we've seen, what we think lies ahead for your communities like yours around the country, what lies ahead for the country as a whole as the work like what you're doing expands to the national level. And we'll try to set up by the end of our presentation, which will be me giving you some points and boring background, Deb giving you some interesting stories, and then me giving you some the least boring final points I can. What we'll try to do is to set up the premises for the larger national moment and wave in which your community's efforts take shape. What we've learned, what we think we don't know, what we're going to try to do for the next stages, and then how we can all best work together. Deb, what am I missing?
Deb, carry on.
Okay.
Well, can you hear me? No. Okay. This is critical. Hello? Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
So this will be actually a sign that I will go first. So I should say too that we have, in preparation for coming here over the past couple of weeks, we've been studying up on the work of the Danville Regional Foundation and the parallel work that a lot of you are doing in your organizations and communities. So this is a rare time when I have the stage and Deb is, by external conditions, is...
Hi, Jim. No.
Soon she'll have her full voice
I can
back.
use the handheld if you want.
Which you'll be glad to hear. So
Okay.
I'll explain the perspective which Deb and I are bringing to the discussions we're having now, and the connections we hope to maintain with you in the weeks and months ahead, because it's sort of a different element to the mix from what you all are having. So first, I know that many of you are specialists by definition in your own communities. You know more about those than we do. Unfortunately, I don't think we went to any of your particular towns in our journeys for the last 4 or 5 years, but the journeys go on. And so we're going to be passing around business cards and looking for next places to go, after we spend this time with you. Also, we know very well that there are people here who are professionals in the kind of systematic thinking about regional development, and this sort of is the theme of our life too, where Deb is kind of making
Hi,
backstage
can you hear me now?
commentary. Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay. Just dressing, undressing.
This is sort of like being in the plane. You're putting on clothes
okay,
for the new destination. So we have the things that many of you know either by direct experience in your communities or that you understand professionally and systematically by being in your consultant groups and your foundations and having action plans, like just for one example, the Orton Foundation has had. These are things we have come to in our journalistic way. So we did 4 or 5 years ago, we didn't know many of the things that I think many of you have been working in the middle of for decades, but we feel as if what we're going to try to add is how this looks from an informed outsider's perspective, and the pattern one would see if the kinds of struggles and successes you're having community by community, if you're applying those around the country, and what this all adds up to. I'll say just a minute's background on how we know, or at least believe, the things that we think we know. Starting about 5 years ago, Deb and I have been together for a long time. We met, I can now disclose, on a blind date 50 years ago in college, and have been together since then. Deb was, at the time, barely born, right? I was a college student, but we've been together for a long time. A lot of the time we spent on the road has been on the road, just trying to understand the way the world works. We had our honeymoon on a work camp in Ghana, which was probably a mistake.
Not to be recommended. No.
We've worked together in China, in Japan and Malaysia for a long time, raised our children largely in East Asia. Deb's book on China is really excellent, and we've really enjoyed the kinds of just intensified intellectual and personal experience you get by going different places, trying to see how they work and what is happening there. And we started doing that about 5 years ago with our project that was for the Atlantic Monthly magazine, where I've worked forever, and for Marketplace Radio, of going to places that were normally outside the media spotlight and trying to say, how does the world look from their perspective? And here's a point that I think is hard to register for my friends in where we normally live in DC, our friends in the media there. We said that we're going to cities that usually appear in the national media only when there's something wrong. When there's a shooting or a flood or a disaster of some kind, including a political campaign, or when there's a concept story of how do people in the heartland feel about this national political issue, whether it's Donald Trump or Obamacare or whatever else. And we thought there was a kind of flattening of what should be the three-dimensional life of interior America that was reduced to one-dimensional or one-and-a-half-dimensional talk show segments in the normal media presentation. And so starting in the summer of 2013, in our little Cirrus airplane, which you see up there, we started traveling around the country. I'll tell you later, if you'd like, how we chose the cities we went to, but basically it was cities that were smaller, that were not on the national media landscape, and that had a problem. And we're trying to see how they had dealt with those problems. And we had a range by region and by ethnic balance and by economic position and stages in the recovery arc. The longer we traveled, sort of the further down the recovery arc we went. That is, early on we went to a place like Greenville, that I know many of you had studied, and where they've sort of become this Fabergé egg of figuring out ways to have a downtown and high tech and all the rest. And we ended up in places like San Bernardino, which is right next to where I grew up, and western Kansas and Erie, Pennsylvania, and others that were much earlier in the recovery process. And we had a number of findings that through the accumulation of hundreds of web posts and dozens of radio broadcasts and a couple of magazine articles and then this book, we felt were worth trying to argue as concertedly as we could, because we thought there was a view of the United States that looks one way from the city by city level, whether it's Greenville or San Bernardino or Gary or any place else, and is entirely different in the national level of discussion. And I'm going to mention these in a couple of tiers relatively briefly before turning it over to Deb for some illustrations, because where I'm going to try to get by the end of our discussion is how the things we've seen apply in a number of communities like those that you represent. But I think it's important to give some of the context. The first and biggest point we were trying to convey, and that for a long time, changing only in the last couple of weeks, was almost impossible to register in brains, especially in DC, but also to a lesser degree in New York and maybe San Francisco, is that at just the time when national politics seemed at a near nadir of polarization and zero-sumness and dysfunction and inability to match all the resources the U.S. has with all the challenges the U.S. has, that at just the time when national politics, regardless of your affiliation, was seeming this way. Across the country, there was a sense, city by city, of people recognizing intense problems, whether they are opioids or law enforcement inequities or losing young people or losing established industries. People were aware of these problems, but felt as if their movement was positive rather than negative. They were finding ways to think about attracting young people back to town, of thinking about the next wave in manufacturing, thinking about experimentation and doing in education, rebuilding downtowns and all the rest. And so there was this tension between the national discourse of America in complete collapse and the local discourse of a troubled country that was finding ways to at least recognize its troubles. And the one bit of actual data I'll give you on this point is a series of ongoing polls that I'm sure many of you have followed, that for the national level, right direction, wrong track polling for the United States, that's been almost one way down for about a generation, and now it's about 2-to-1 negative. But the comparable poll about people's views of their own communities is the near mirror image. By about 2-to-1, it's positive, of people feeling their communities, despite their problems, and like ones you are reckoning with them, and are finding some ways to get traction. And that still stands as news. And it was actually, I'll give you one other anecdote, self-referential, but maybe you can understand why. When the review of our book came out 6 months ago in the Washington Post, there was a very sort of sniffy, oh, this must be cherry picking, because they're saying in what we know to be a country full of American carnage, they're finding these positive spots. Sure, that's how it looks if you're flying around in an airplane, a sniffy review. Yesterday, in the Washington Post's opinion section, there was a lead article by Jeffrey Cabaservice, who's a known historian and intellectual, saying the main hope for American politics is that the renewal, chronicled by Deborah and James Fallows, at the local level will percolate up and come to the national level, that this is what's happening. So I think there's been this registering around, even now seeping into the national media, that there is this tension. There are a lot of sort of sub themes and surprises, and I'm not going to go the whole list through just so I can turn the platform over to Deb, but I will mention just two of them briefly, which I think are relevant to your communities, and I'll come back to in my closing part. One is we saw repeated and surprising evidence to us of a new modern talent migration, by which I mean, and I go into the sum in the book, but I'll sort of say it more crisply now. It certainly is true that in the history of modern societies, people collect in the biggest cities. They go from Scotland to London. And through American history, the American literature is people going from the farm to the village, to the small town, to the big town, to New York, to San Francisco, and this continues. We were struck, however, by how often we came across the reverse phenomenon of people who had worked in New York, who had gone to Stanford, who had offers from Amazon in Seattle, and decided that instead the balance for them was better in Duluth, or in Greenville, or in Danville, or in Dubuque, or in Fresno, or in San Bernardino, or a number of other places. Of course, and the point is that these contradictory realities are going on, and there is enough there around the country of smaller communities finding ways to either attract back people who had some tie there, or attract anew people who are looking for ways to start their businesses, to raise their families, to have lower costs, that the wind is at the back of small communities after centuries of seeming as if it were a one-way headwind, using aviation terms in that regard. The other point I'll make is that we were struck by the contrast between the lived reality of immigration and ethnic change, city by city, versus its national level discourse. You all know the national level discourse of immigration in the past couple of years. What's striking, and again bolstered by the polls, is the only place where there's really acute fear of immigrants now in the United States is where they aren't. You know, where there aren't immigrants, people are concerned about this. Where there are, there's a sense that more or less the pace of American assimilation over the centuries is still continuing. And this was a big theme that we found city by city, that places that were deliberately making themselves open, attractive to people from different regions, of different generations, different races, different international backgrounds, they were doing better than ones that weren't. Have a lot of other trends and themes and things that we were talking about, but I'm going to turn the stage over to Deb now about a particular way in which, a particular pattern we saw of cities that were innovating to make themselves attractive, vibrant, and solving the challenges that many of you are dealing with. So I give you Deborah Fallows.
Thanks. So I'd like to talk about this, how towns are changing through some storytelling. And when we first started doing storytelling, I didn't really believe in it. I thought maybe it was just a little bit fluffy. But I've really come to believe in it as an important way of talking about it. And I think you all know, since many of you are practitioners, that it brings the theorizing and the political positioning and the policy down to the street level where things are actually happening and where they actually matter, where they're actually real. And I think that some of these stories will resonate with you. I hope you remember a couple of them, and I also hope that you can take away with them some little spark thinking, well, my town should do that, or we can do that. They're often really little points, but they can grow into much more meaningful points. When I was reading through your DRF website, which is incredible, there's so much stuff packed in there, one caught my eye, which was how many of the towns named Milton, of which Milton, North Carolina, I guess is one, connected with other towns named Milton around the country and built this kind of Milton Club, sharing, what they did and making some connections and forming an identity. I immediately thought I should take that back to my hometown of Vermilion, Vermilion, Ohio, which is on the lake. There are plenty of, I know there's a Vermilion in South Dakota, and I've seen reference to others. They're all spelled differently, but that's okay. And it's just a really nice little tiny idea that anybody can do. Well, most towns can do. Maybe not Danville. I don't know. But as a way of connecting. Two tiny ideas like this that caught my eye recently is, both came from libraries actually. One is in Erie, Pennsylvania, where Erie is and right on the lake, also Lake Erie in Pennsylvania, and famous for its nautical heritage. Oliver Hazard Perry was there in the War of 1812. The library is right on the water, and the harbor where the tall ships replicas come in is right in front of the library. So the library decided that every time a tall ship came in, they would hit the bell, and then people would go rushing to the window and look at the tall ships outside. So it was really, it's a small move, but it's a connector to the history of the town and kind of makes people proud. Not every town can do that, but they can do something like that. And I heard a few weeks ago about a library in Denmark that has a hotline to the hospital in Denmark. They put a gong in the library, and every time a baby is born in that community, they hit the gong. And they said it's just such a nice thing for people in the community to think, a new citizen is born in our town. And any town can do that if the hospitals will cooperate. But it's those little things that can instill some kind of sense of pride and belonging seem important. So I want to give you three different areas of a little bit of storytelling that I hope to that they'll to put some interpretation around them. One is about education, mainly K through 12 in communities we've seen. One is about public institutions in communities, and one is about the public arts in communities. So I know that you all are concentrating a lot on maybe high schools and certainly community colleges in workforce development. And many of you have been to Greenville, but for those of you who have not been to Greenville, South Carolina, there's a really interesting example of the partnerships that were put together in that town at the very elementary level between the engineering company, the engineers in the company, the big industries of BMW, Michelin, and GE, and the school system in Greenville when they were looking to kind of up the ante on what was going on in certainly the elementary school level. So they got together, the engineers in the school system, and decided to build in a very distressed part of town the A.J. Wittenberg Elementary School of Engineering. And this elementary school of engineering for kids pre-K through about grade 5, the idea that they would go into a distressed part of town, build a great school, that completely worked, that they would bring in the local intelligence and occupation from the engineers to be volunteers in that school and help set the curriculum in that school, and that they would, along the way, build up their workforce from the very early levels to have relevant positions in that town that really worked for everybody. It worked incredibly well, and they extended it in this cooperative sense to the middle school, the Finney Fisher Middle School, and they said, these kids are great at STEM. Now we need to instill in them a sense of the arts so they can be great collaborators, great speakers, great just cooperative workers and thinkers, and they built this STEAM school, STEM with an arts faculty in it, where they're just turning out these whole little smart people in the town. So I think it's a great example of how these public and private partnerships can work in that level. There's another one from Winters, California, which is a tiny town of 10,000 people in the top of the Central Valley in California, agriculture town. They have nut trees and stone fruit trees like apricots and plums and things. The town was concerned because they wanted to find a way to keep these kids in the town and make them an attractive place for them to live as adults. So they infused a big agriculture program in the high school where they teach the kids not only that they start with the history and economics of agriculture in California. They have really hands-on elements where they teach the kids how to use and maintain the big farm equipment where a lot of their parents work. They teach them a business of running family farms or other kinds of agriculture business. So it's these kids would come out equipped to maintain what a lot of times their parents or grandparents had started. And they also send them to, they have a farm outside their school where they all work and all kinds of what we used to call shop, but it has 3D printers and computer aided creative things and all kinds of stuff like that. And they send them to the 4-H for these soft skills, like how to give speeches or how to write papers or how to do presentations, the same kind of idea that STEAM schools do. So it's just, those are really excellent examples, I think, of how the towns know what their local assets are and how they build on those to educate their kids, their youngest kids, in a really relevant way, and also use it as a lure to kind of help their towns thrive in the future. The public institutions that we saw were one of my favorite just discoveries one by one of going from towns to town. And I mean by that the libraries, the YMCAs, the parks and recreation, and the collaboration that often comes among those public institutions. In Redlands, California, where we spent a lot of time, it's Jim's hometown, but it's also a great example of a very volunteer-focused, philanthropic little town where just about, it seems like everybody participates in what's going on in the town. They have, for example, this cooperative effort in the public library between them and the public schools. Every single fourth grader in Redlands is part of the library organized tour of the kind of hot spots and history spots throughout the town. So they load them on the buses, they take them around to where the first orange groves were, where the founding fathers lived, a lot of the old amazing Victorian houses. These folks were generally from New England or from the East, Pennsylvania, and really give those kids a sense of the history of the town. So it's the library and the schools working together, and then those kids, as I've heard from a lot of their parents, go home and they start talking about it, because a number of those families don't have that history. They're quote, newcomers to the little town. And they tell their parents about it, and they just, it becomes part of the family conversation of this is our town, and the kids are pointing out these things to their parents. Back in Erie, there's another great thing in Redlands. The YMCA, which is a stronghold of the town, has paired with the Redlands Community Hospital. There's a lot of obesity among youth in the town, as is not surprising. And the hospital was where a lot of these kids ended up for their rehab programs, found that the kids weren't doing very well in these programs. So they paired with the YMCA and decided, let's make this fun. So instead of the kids having to go to school and say, I have to go to the hospital after school, they say, I'm going to the Y after school for a program, and they get them into these physical education programs that makes it not a badge of shame, maybe not a badge of honor, but a badge that you can talk about with some sense of pride. And that was the community knowing each other and getting together to create some kind of new and progressive program. In Erie, Pennsylvania, the library is Erie, Pennsylvania had 10% of their population is refugees. And they've been taking refugees from, well, when they started with immigrants at the turn of the century, but when we were there visiting for a number of times, we met them from all over, the latest ones from Syria and Sudan and Somalia and Bhutan and Iraq and Iran and Nepal. The first stop for those refugees in town is the public library. They give them library cards, they show them all the resources in the library, they encourage them to use the computers, and often, this is their connection to home or people they loved and can't communicate with anymore through the public library, and it's all free. So it's, institutions like this, not only are they wonderful for helping the refugees in Erie become vital parts of the community, but it's also a great marketing tool for democracy in America, that this stuff is free and available to them, and these are public institutions that are so strong. And I think especially now we could really use with a little great marketing of some of these principles around the country, and the librarians are definitely a first, I wouldn't say line of defense, active line of operation in where that happens. The final thing I'd like to talk a little bit about are the arts in communities. And again, this is something that Jim and I are latecomers to. We're not really artistic people, and we needed some schooling on what public arts can mean to communities. And I'm talking about things that are visible, like here in Danville, you've got the murals, which a lot of towns have. You've got public art that lets people that reminds people of the narrative and the story of their town in everyday life. But it goes into many more implications than that kind of reminder. In art as civic engagement, in San Bernardino, California, which some of you may remember from the shootings, it's a really troubled town. It was bankrupt, it lost its Air Force Base, it lost its highway, it lost all kinds of things, and there are a group of young millennials, give or take, in the town they call themselves San Bernardino Generation Now. They're primarily artistic kids who also have day jobs, but they got together and said, look, we're just tired of all this naysaying in San Bernardino. We're going to use what we know how to do, the arts, to engage people ultimately, so they will pay attention to the civic issues going on in town, and they will vote and help for change in their town. So they actually did this. They started with the murals. They started with cleaning up parks. They gained a little following of young kids. They held festivals and music performances. They took videos of all of these things and built them around public issues. They took those videos into the high school as an educational tool for ultimately registering the older kids to vote and for getting them as a hook to their parents to get them to vote. And it actually worked. So you had this artistic endeavor ending up with changing civic engagement in voting. Art as a reckoning with the past of the history of the town is really, we saw a number of examples of this. One in Columbus, Mississippi, which is it's in the middle of Mississippi, in northeast Mississippi. There's a high school there where the social studies teacher, it's a governor's school, and I understand you have this is a governor's school, yeah. The one in Mississippi is a junior and senior in high school boarding school where the kids come from all over, from the Delta, from the Shacks and Channies, from Hattiesburg. All kinds of kids come and live there. It's a mathematics and science school. But the social studies teacher has gotten those kids together to And the project is they go to the cemetery, which is a Civil War cemetery. They research what was happening in the era from the lives of the people who are buried in that cemetery. They go to the archives of the county library, which happens to be in Columbus, Mississippi, tiny town, but the county seat. And they create these productions, these dramatic productions with music that they take to the cemetery and address some of the deepest racial issues of the past of Columbus, Mississippi, bring them to the public and get people talking. So, these kids are making art that engages the public in a really important fact, the most important factor, if not in our country, certainly in Mississippi and Columbus, Mississippi. There are a bunch of other things about what public arts do, but those are just a few. And I wanted to end that section with, there's a teacher in Greenville, South Carolina named Roy Fleurer, and he said something, I hope I can remember his quote, which really struck me, about the importance of public art in towns. And he said, the art that happens in Greenville lets the world know that there's a town in South Carolina that cares for the human spirit. And I thought that was just a good kind of sense of how art does more than just be art. Yeah.
I'm going to quickly shift back to some of the practicalities of how the kinds of things we've seen and are trying to describe and have stories that, like those Deb has been telling, what they might mean in communities like yours, and then we can have a discussion of how this matches or doesn't your own experience. I was thinking, as Deb mentioned, the Milton Club of towns with similar names. There could be a Burlington Club and a Springfield Club and a Greenville Club. My hometown is Redlands, California. The only book written about Redlands has the title, Only One Redlands. So we're probably not going to have a Redlands Club, but we could be honorary members of.
You're always confused with Redwood City
and Reading, and sort of linguistically, we could be like Vermilion. So in practical terms, we have at the end of our book a 10.5 signs of civic success, which was our sort of distilled effort to say what characterizes the towns we've seen. There are things like people who have a shared sense of the civic story, of where we've come from, where we are, and how long we have to be patient for where we're going. And that really matters so that people aren't just living someplace, they're part of it. And you could identify the civic patriots, and that you could identify public-private partnerships. Interestingly, this is one other tip or perception that people in DC are instinctively skeptical about. They hear public-private and they think it's some sweetheart deal or log rolling, and that is a gulf between national politics and local levels. And the half point on our checklist of the 10.5 points was having brew pubs, because as a real thing, it shows a certain kind of clientele, a certain kind of entrepreneurial activity, and all the rest. And we can talk later about these 10.5 points if you'd like. What I will say is I've been thinking as we prepared for this session about a couple of larger transcendent lessons I think we have learned that apply to any city or any region in the process of reconstructing itself, that I know a lot of you are. And I think of them being these 3 points. One is recognizing and sharing the understanding that this is a long process. And this may seem obvious. It's worth mentioning this is a distinction from national politics, where long-term planning is essentially impossible. Long-term in national politics, it's as far away as 2 years from now with the next election, and as near-term as the next budget crisis, or the next you have a funding bill for 10 days. But we were at a session last week in Detroit with Ashley Swearingen, the former mayor of Fresno, California. Some of you may have been to, and you may know her. And she was saying that Fresno is coming a long way, but she said this is either 10 years into a 20-year process or 20 years into a 40-year process. But we were struck in the places we went, how many people would be able to say, if you were here 10 years ago, this now nice hotel would have been a crack den. If you're here 5 years ago, this downtown place would have been very dangerous to come to. Or other cities we went where they say if you're here 5 years from now, you'll be able to see these things we're putting in process. So I think one trait that we would reinforce in your work is that this is a long process, and get everybody involved for that, and allowing you to measure how this month's status compared to 6 months from now and a year from now. This is one shared trait we saw of places that mattered. A second, which is something that Deb alluded to several times, but to us became a dividing point between places that seemed to be going someplace and those who were having troubles, was a very acute, deep, and unsentimental assessment of what their region was, what its history was, what its assets were, what its liabilities were, what its reputation was, who was likely to go there, who was not. And I would put this on an extreme, places making themselves into the next Silicon Valley or even the next Greenville. No town is going to be exactly the next Greenville. No place is going to be exactly the next Silicon Valley. Boston is not the next Silicon Valley. It's the next Boston. And I think the communities we saw that had this sense of how they could be the next version of themselves. How Duluth, for instance, could go from having been a century ago the place where all the wealth of the western United States in timber and mining and grain would reach seaports through the port of Duluth on the westernmost part of the Great Lakes. It's not going to be exactly that ever again, but it's become this recreation center, and it's become an aerospace center. We were in Charleston, West Virginia extensively this summer, and they're not going to be the next coal capital that's a whole separate topic, but there's a different kind of nextness they had in mind for Charleston. So this very clear assessment of what is the next accurate, honest, unsentimental rendering of one's own place seemed to us very important, or striking as we saw successes. Probably the final one was recognizing, as you all have, that there is a complex, multiplayer, virtuous cycle that you can observe once it gets going, but requires all hands on deck to start. That it involves public schools, and involves community colleges, and businesses, and the state government, and the national government, and the local government, and NGOs, and young people, and old people, and recreation, and arts, and libraries, and every other part of the mix you can say. And this is, on the one hand, it seems like a banal point, but it's important because so many places there's the impulse to say, well, let's just do this. And we've been struck by the breadth of the vision of places we've seen that can either look back 10 years or 20 years in the past and see how far they've come, or look 10 or 20 years in the future and see where they're headed, of their appreciation that of a fact that it's really unfortunate that the phrase I'm about to use has become politicized. The phrase is, of course, it takes a village. I'm sorry that has a politicized connotation, but it takes a small town, it takes complexity, it takes the public-private partnership. I feel that in my bones in a way I didn't 4 or 5 years ago, just because we've seen it so many places, and being able to share with everybody the fact that it does require all these dominoes, all these moving parts, all the complexity of a watch where every gear has to eventually be machined to meet the other gears. So again, these may be points that are obvious to you from your professionalism, but to us the fact that it's a long process, that it requires acute local awareness and understanding, and that requires all the different parts. These were very important parts of what we felt we had to give illustrations of in our book, and what we hope we'll be doing now for the foreseeable future when we grow up. A final point, I'm going to have a final half point, then a final full point. The final half point is not involving breweries, although I look forward to seeing the one this evening. But it involves Deb and me. We've spent the last 5 years on the road, seeing towns like yours, the last 6 months going city by city by city around the country in gatherings like this to talk to people in Pensacola and Little Rock and Eau Claire and Bellingham, Washington. Sideline, who's been to Bellingham? Who knows the Bellingham civic motto? Talk about self-awareness. Its self-aware civic motto, officially, no joke, is the city of subdued excitement. So these Northwesterners, they know themselves. That's their official motto. We've been going all around. We've been talking with people about how to connect what they're doing with their colleagues around the country and the role we can play. And so the half point is pretty soon we're going to be off the road, excuse me, and hoping that what we want to do for the foreseeable future is travel again, not like we've been doing for the last 5 years, but a lot, writing again. We're doing a full HBO documentary based on our book, which we'll be filming of next year, and essentially trying to tell the stories of what you all are doing, sharing the knowledge, sharing the successes, sharing the blind alleys, just trying to make a movement of all of this, because we think an actual movement is going on. Which brings me to the main point, or the real point, which is, as this, it was surprisingly important for me to see this editorial in the Washington Post yesterday by Jeffrey Cavaservis, essentially acknowledging, as if everyone knew it and accepted the point, that there was this wave underway in local level and some state level governance in the United States. As you're aware, most of the state and local initiatives that were on the ballot this past week passed in a progressive direction. I mean, small p, nonpartisan progressive. Anti-gerrymandering, expanding voting, having changes in criminal justice, having civic engagement. The midterm election turnout this past year was the highest since 1914. And even the young people were turning out. And I think there is the sense, not simply that America needs a local level engagement and revival, as has been evident to everybody over the last decade, but that America is beginning to recognize that it has such a thing. That what we have been hoping for and been writing about over the past year, that people would recognize there is critical mass and there are shared experiences and shared lessons, and that people can be part of a larger whole, that is beginning to be recognized. And so I think there is the prospect for you in your regional and local developments, with all the historical challenges we're facing of ongoing economic dislocation, which happens in every decade, and ongoing strain on really small settlements, which has happened through American history, and ongoing national level dysfunction, which we're having a lot of. Those things we recognize, but I think it's worth, I can tell you from actual belief that there is a wind behind all of us, and Deb and I for the next while want to keep sort of blowing into those sails and having the wind behind the flotilla that we're all part of. So I think you can, as you deal with the experiments, challenges, solutions, and problems in your home communities, you can think the larger perspective is becoming much brighter as of late 2018 and the couple years ahead than it may have been in the past decade or for a longer time than that. So that is what that's the message of actual sincere encouragement that Deb and I feel. And with that, I give you Deb for a final word.
I think I would just pile on a bit to Jim's last point. I know you all have been at this a long time. I can see that from your website. And from our experience, when we started this project in 2013, which seems like about 5,000 years ago right now, the reaction we got from people, especially in our hometown now of DC, was kind of, isn't that charming? Like the way you pat a little kitten or something. Isn't that charming? Isn't that quaint what you're doing? And that didn't really change until about 2016, late 2016, I think, when people were kind of like more aware of things that were changing or seemed to be changing, or people said they were changing in the country or recognizing something. But we know it has been going on for a long time, like you all have been saying, but like Jim says, it really feels now more and more like people are doing what they've always done, whatever their passion is, education or development or the environment, but with much more energy and much more sense of being compelled to do it. And that's kind of bringing into this big tent people who weren't ready to hear it before, but are starting to hear it now. That's what I got.
There's more we could say, but we'll stop for now just to hear discussions, questions, objections, compliments, anything.
Let's thank them for those initial remarks. Not particularly subdued excitement, so I don't think we're going to Washington anytime soon. So what we wanted to do is ask a few questions, sort of pushing on the book a little bit, and then ask y'all eventually to come up, I'll tell you when, to come up and ask your questions and have a conversation. I put the mic that close, so you don't really get these opportunities all that often to come up and spend time like this in an intimate session. So thank you. First, just confession, I'm a travel junkie and a travel log junkie. My favorite all-time book, second after Our Towns, is Following the Equator, which is a Mark Twain book where it was his first trip outside the country, and what he wrote over and over, this is 1897, and he was well known and well traveled in the US and had written extensively, was just shock and awe that there was so much of the world he had been making like he knew for so long, and then he got there and found out he didn't know anything. And so when I read Our Towns, one of the things that hit me was how often we're in our own bubble, in our own town, and we're pretty sure we live in our daily lives and we watch the national news. And that's what we think the world is, well, we must be like this and all of them must be like that. Because we're not like that, but that's what we see. So I just asked a comment on, as the spirit that you heard. I know that I agree with you 100%, the enthusiasm there. Why is it that we're stuck in our own bubbles locally? Is this media? Is it laziness on our part? What causes it?
This is a question we have, I'll start off with it, that we have mulled over a lot, and let me give you two background context points. This isn't, although it's, I think, a particularly acute problem now, it's not an entirely new problem. For example, back in 1910, Walter Lippmann wrote a book called Public Opinion. And it was, he was positing the problem of how people were going to have to make decisions about things they could not possibly experience themselves. And it was when radio was first coming into effect. And he was saying, we're hearing all this news from Europe, which was then moving towards World War I, which of course ended 100 years ago yesterday. And he was saying, how are people who've never been to France or Germany to make sense of these radio reports? And he said we're victims of what he called the pictures in our mind, the pictures in our head. And so this is something, it's a fundamental human problem. I did a book, not in 1910, but 22 years ago, in 1996, called Breaking the News, which was about a modern version of that phenomenon of how, if the line, as I argue, between information and entertainment were entirely blurred, as, side note, it is now, it would be really a problem, because entertainment will always win in that competition. The point of entertainment is to be entertaining, and so it will always compel more eyeballs than pure information does. And the point I'll sort of get ahead to here is, and one other background point. How many of you remember the cartoon, famous New Yorker cover by Saul Steinberg, looking at the world from the Upper East Side of Manhattan, where Park Avenue is in loving detail, and maybe 7th Avenue, and then there's the river, and then there's a bunch of nothing, and then there's Los Angeles, and there's a bunch of nothing, and there's China. Sort of that's how I think it's a long-term issue. It's become acute now because both national politics and national media are at a particularly phantasmagoric scream painting type of mode, where people with things people experience in their firsthand life, they still recognize the complexity, which is why I think immigration is relatively normal at the local level. But you think every place out there, it must be this nightmare, beyond be dragons. And so I think that we can't exist forever with this contradiction between a nightmare of the national and realism of the local. But the problem I think the main problem is the way our picture of national politics has become like a Munch scream painting.
Well, I'm going to go down a different tack a little bit from this, right? So I think during the 5 years that we were traveling, first it was just a bit of a shock that we thought, how can we have landed in Red Oak, Iowa and never heard of this place before when we see that there's so much going on. It quickly grew into a sense of we were very humbled to not have known that and to see everything that was going on, and we felt what a big luxury it was to go from town to town and spend weeks at a time doing, not going necessarily to fairs and baseball games, although we did that too, but just trying to understand and see and witness and listen to things about the everyday life of everyday people in those towns. I think we've become very different kinds of travelers. We've traveled through our whole life and tended toward going to factories rather than going to museums, but we did that too. And I think one of the lessons that I would love to impart is, if you're having a chance to go to a new town, do all the usual tourist things, but also first stop in the public library and just ask. Anybody can do this. Walk up to the librarian and say, hey, what's going on in your town? What's there, the heart and soul of things that are happening in the town. And you can find yourself, you go with an impression and you suddenly find, I was wrong. I should actually be pivoting and turning to go see X or Y, and it was very different. So we learned a lot about how to be visitors in the town.
My wife has always taken me to public libraries, so I'll tell her if she's
Good,
right.
she was right.
Okay, so be it. I was reading also the sort of the Tocqueville model of American and sort of Capra-esque, that we really are, we live an American life, but it really, the Upper East Side American life and the RV through the West American life does seem a bit far apart, and maybe it's contributing to our divide, or maybe we just don't have enough Charles Kuralt on TV, or what is it these days?
This we've thought about a lot too. We've lived outside the U.S. for a long time. We as I said, we had our honeymoon in Ghana, and then we were in East Asia for a long time, in Japan and Malaysia and China. The reason I mention that is that I think you realize, being outside the U.S., how enormously powerful the American national identity is. I did a web series when we were living in China that was based actually on the fact that I asserted I could tell on sight a Chinese American from a Chinese person, or a Vietnamese American from a Vietnamese person, or even a Korean American from a Korean person, just because of the way people were. How they carried themselves, et cetera. And on the subway in Tokyo, as somebody with whom I would have nothing in common in the United States, I'd have a glance across, this crowded subway car, and immediately this person, it could be, a black woman from Mississippi, it could be a white man from Idaho, it could be somebody with whom I'm not, I wouldn't think I was the same person in the U.S. Obviously, we were the same person, that subway car in Tokyo. And I think that there are times in the American national identity where this e pluribus unum part has come through. The classic, of course, would be the Frank Capra World War II movies, where you have every different part of the then segregated U.S. Army together in the foxhole. And there are times, tragically often driven by emergency or war, when Americans are capable of that. A further allusion to 1910. To my mind, the most important essay in American political history is William James's 1910 essay, The Moral Equivalent of War, reflecting back on the Civil War, how it was the greatest disaster in American history, but also brought out all this nobility. He was talking about the Union Army, nobility and sacrifice, et cetera, saying, how can a place as chaotic as the United States do that without having a war? I think that in a way, that's my answer to your question. It's the ongoing challenge of finding the parts of the American identity that are shared, despite the RV in Kansas and the Upper East Side of Manhattan and the Mission in San Francisco. There was something, if these people were all together on the Tokyo subway, they'd all exchange a glance across the car.
Deb, you talked about the composed narrative of places also, that not only do we have sort of people, but places have their own identity too. And feel free to talk about both, but I mean, communities talk about themselves or see themselves as a thing also, right?
They do, and so here is a little quiz, and it might work in this group or it might not. We discovered as we were going along that there was a kind of icebreaker question that people would ask each other. It would be in a group like this, but imagine that you're all from the same town rather than you're from different towns. Because here when you're meeting each other, you're probably saying where you're from or what is it that you do. There is a currency of towns, and there's a kind of identity and a go-to thing of towns that lets you see what the mental, social geography is. In Greenville, South Carolina, the question is, where do you go to church? Because that is important in Greenville, and that lets you know kind of where you fit into the socioeconomic political scale, because that's what churches, how they divvy up people. In our home in Washington, D.C., it is, of course, where do you work, or who do you work for? What do you do? There's a what do you do question in Burlington, Vermont, and Denver, but it means what do you do for fun? You know, what do you ski? Do you skate? Do you go on boats? That's a better what do you do than our what do you do. In anybody here from St. Louis or grew up in St. Louis? The question in St. Louis, without fail, is where'd you go to high school? It's just kind of the definition of the town and how you focus on the town. In LA now, it's how'd you get here? Well, I took the I-10 to the 405. Traffic is what happens in that town. In no kidding, in Wyoming, the question is, and this is, I thought they were pulling our leg, but it's an important question. Did you get your elk yet? You're allowed to get it, shoot your elk, and it says something about you and your connection to that sense of place if you got your elk or not.
I don't want you to skip Dallas, North Carolina, my hometown, but the question there is who your kin.
Who your kin.
Just like that.
Yep.
Not who are, but who your kin.
And the version of that in New Orleans is who's your mama?
Yep.
Right, because you know who your daddy is, and everybody kind of knows everybody.
So pre-warning, I've got 2 more questions, and I'm going to ask y'all to come up. So just be ready for some of you. I want to talk about third places for a few minutes. The civic areas, and I did work in Sioux Falls some years back, and the park certainly was taking on it something. But third places, usually defined as not work, not home, but the places that communities gather, whether it's the trail system out in Northwest Arkansas, or some, the Oyster Bar at somewhere on the South Carolina coast. They seem to me to be rising in their importance for both community identity and for conversations. Do you see that?
Absolutely, yeah. And they're, besides that, and I completely agree, and brew pubs are actually one of those now, and they even have civic things. They're kind of rivaling the library for, book clubs in the brew pub, and family zones and things like that. But another point about the public places that I think are so critical, we found, you are face to face with and rub shoulders with and exchange with people that you normally might not in your everyday life through work or your street where you live, or even your school where the kids go. And on the one hand, you are forced to because everybody's there. On the other hand, it's an opportunity because I think people just become more empathetic. When you see somebody face them in the eye, it's not anonymous. You have some sense of who they are, why they're there, what they look like, what they're wearing, what they're talking about, even if you're just passing them. But it's that opportunity to crash into people you would not normally crash into. I don't mean crash, but you know what I mean.
And we saw those trails in northwest Arkansas recently. Those are great. And the only thing I'd add to what Deb says, I think we've had a number of discussions with Robert Putnam over the years in our travels, and he's been saying, well, his bowling leagues in northern Ohio are dying out. And I think that formal sociology is not catching up with the new ways some of these places and connections are being created. There are these, what I view as the nightmare of the shared workspaces, but they're places where people get together and sporting venues of various kinds, and there just seem to be new ways in which we've seen, sometimes unique to each city, sometimes patterns we've seen in a number of places, different kinds of counterparts to what had been the bowling leagues. We were in Charleston, West Virginia, that I mentioned over the summer, and the outdoor concerts there were quite impressive in bringing the much greater ethnic and racial diversity of Charleston than you would think, all in one place, for outdoor entertainment.
So my last question before we open it up is, we're focusing on workforce here, and we went around today and let everybody introduce themselves and talk about their issue, and I commented that we got all the way around the room and there were still new issues coming up by every person, that it's such a complexity. I was wondering, on your travels, as you were talking to people, were they thinking about their kids' future of work? Were they worried? Were they concerned that there wouldn't be work, or they didn't know what the work was, or how were they thinking about the economics of their community and work into the future?
I would distinguish between the way any family thinks about its own dynamics and the kids we have or don't, or our nephews or whatever. I think there's a dynamic that goes to any family in the way communities were thinking about their future. And we found something we personally in our ignorance hadn't expected, which was how actively, in particular, community colleges and career technical programs and apprenticeship programs were finding ways to fill this gap, and the gap being between the new kinds of good job opportunities that are opening up and a rising generation of people whose parents had the good job opportunities that don't exist anymore. The people whose parents might have worked in the factory's not there anymore, so how do these kids get prepared for jobs in advanced manufacturing or in construction or in welding or in health services or whatever else, where there are a lot of the equivalent to those old good factory jobs. So we found most communities thinking about that really creatively. We're surprised by how many apprenticeship programs and all these other things were springing up.
And I would extend that, okay, so you've got that kind of community response and community mindset that we found. Also I have such faith in the young people now. I mean, we have young people in our families, and we got a whole bunch of very young people now, 5 of them. Thank you. The way I see our kids and their generation living their lives is in a much less prescribed way than we did. And I think that while, of course, they want to give their individual kids all the opportunity in the world, I think that menu has become so much larger for parents of children growing up now, that they see that there are many more paths than just go straight to college. Otherwise, that's it. Yeah.
we always say happy and self-sufficient are our only two goals. So we're good on that. All right, open up questions if you want. Come up to the microphone. I have only 42 more if you don't come up, but let's queue up, please.
Thank you. This was wonderful. My name is Barbara Dyer, and I'm with MIT, and I want you to know that we introduced a new course last year called Bridging the American Divides USA Lab. Carl Stober was very helpful in helping us put that together. This year, we've assigned your book as part of the syllabus. My question to you, this is an action learning program where the students have deep discussions. This is the MIT Sloan School, so they're graduate students, about these issues that are confronting us and in the context of history as well as the present. But then we send them off to these places around the country. And you're telling a story of great resilience and optimism. And you have a particular way of approaching communities. And I'm hoping, maybe in private conversation, but a few tidbits here, about ways to approach this, teams of young people going into communities that are new to them and unfamiliar.
So first, thank you very much for paying attention and assigning the book. We're extremely grateful, and we'll look forward to going up in person to express our gratitude. And we'll be happy to talk to you this evening and about all this. Is there anybody else here a reporter by trade? To our reporter colleagues, the main message we try to hammer home, and it sort of is the case for academic researchers too, is that 99.9% of the time when a national publication, a newspaper, a network goes to a smaller town, they start out asking people, what do you think about Trump? Do you like Hillary? What about Mueller? Are you angry, et cetera, which immediately just shrinks all life to a cable news talk show. And so I think that people are, as people anywhere would be, are acutely sensitive to being used as sort of specimens on a pre-existing grid. They're not interesting in themselves, but they're interesting only for how they fit on the grid. So we usually just ask them, what's the story here? What are people hopeful about? What are they concerned about? My version in my own life of Deb's second question, have you got your elk, et cetera, what I've always just asked people when I meet them is, what's your story? And there's a version that allows you to say what's interesting about you and what's significant. And that's kind of the way we've approached these towns. I think it helped that we both think of ourselves as small town people, right?
Yeah, so I'm going to answer that question as a complete non-reporter. I never did this before we started this. And the first time I had to start a conversation with someone was terrifying because I skipped a whole lot of libraries at the beginning because I thought, well, what am I supposed to ask? Why would I go in there? Why would they talk to me? And the answer is, you just ask anything, and yes, they'll talk to you. People love to talk about their towns. And if you ask a kind of leading question like, so tell me, what are some of the issues going on in these towns? You get a torrent, and we tried to do research before we went, and it usually turned out that we were going down the wrong chute. You start a conversation and you can go into the newspaper office and talk to the local reporter, and they'll steer you in the interesting direction, which is not what you thought it was going to be. And then, as Jim said, just showing up is 90% of it. But I would be very hopeful that you just kind of do it instinctively, go in with a couple questions, and by the second or third day, they have a sense. You get a sense of things, and it's all very surprising and open and much easier than you would guess. Nobody needs to be trained for this. Sorry.
It's true. I mean, the great thing about
People are
journalism,
teachable.
it's an entirely uncredentialed profession, which is good. Everybody can just get into it. One other...
Just recently.
Yeah. So there was a related point, which I'll save for, we can, well, here it is, that by the time we got to our second or third town, we were doing real-time blog posts along the way. So by the time we got to, let's say, Allentown, PA, we could say, look, here's the kind of thing we wrote about Sioux Falls, and here's the kind of thing we wrote about Eastport, Maine. So we can give you an example of the kind of thing we're doing, which is not making fun of yokels or saying here's another declining place, but just saying here are some of the people who are trying and either succeeding or struggling when it comes to the town. So I think as you have a corpus of things you can point people toward, then that gives them some reassurance too.
I hate that it's people from Washington taking the mic, but hi, I'm Tony Pippa from the Brookings Institution, and I have a colleague who's actually been studying optimism and its connection to well-being, and the importance of optimism actually to community well-being. And so, a question just, especially for communities that have found themselves in economic and cultural distress, have fallen on hard times. What was the role of optimism there? Where did that optimism come from? Can it be cultivated? Can people from the outside help cultivate it? And a corollary to that, talking about people from the outside, what would you say to outside policymakers and others with resources? What would be the advice you would be giving them to be have as much impact as possible and to be as supportive as possible?
So can I answer the optimism question?
Yeah, well, you do the language part of it.
Okay, yes. So Deb has a PhD in linguistics point to make on this. So I have no graduate degree. Deb is an esteemed PhD, so she gets all the hard questions. I'm going to ask you answer the optimism question. It really is amazing how widespread is the awareness of being looked down on in some way. Appalachia in general, the South in general, the central part of California where I'm from, the flyover states, et cetera, Rust Belt states. And really, once you move off the east side of Manhattan, sort of everybody has some sense of being looked down on some way. There is, on the one hand, a reality of the past centuries of American history that really, really small settlements may face insuperable obstacles. And I think, in the 150 years since the Civil War, it's been the case, I believe, that most counties have lost population at that time, as really, really small farming era settlements have died. But once you get to scale that is viable in some way in modern society, we were impressed how many places found ways to turn the shared awareness of either looking down or being looked down on into a motivating tool. Just two examples. The silly one in Fresno. Anybody here from California, as I am, knows that Fresno is sort of the, it's not the stylish part of California. They've changed sort of quasi-officially their motto to Fres Yes. And so, they have all the sort of the young tech startup people there saying, we're tired, Grandpa, of you saying this is a town for losers. We see all this opportunity there. The other, which I describe in the book, is from the Golden Triangle of Mississippi, where many of you have been, where Joe Max Higgins, this kind of force of nature guy who's brought a lot of industry there, was saying once they started making helicopters there for Airbus has its helicopter factory, saying, we're in Mississippi, we're making shit that flies. We can do anything. And in West Virginia, same consciousness. So I think a deliberately willed embrace of the fact that people think Erie is for losers, Cleveland is for losers, Detroit is for losers, Pittsburgh was for losers, saying, we're going to show you actually we're ahead of that curve. So we saw lots of examples of people grasping that thorn and saying, yeah, we're going to show you.
And Eastport, Maine may be one of the best examples of this. It's a tiny town, only 1,400 people. It's so cold. It's so far away from everything else that's on the Bay of Fundy. They have had their problems, but the leadership, which is just about everybody in the town, has this positive attitude where they will say yes to anything. If they want it, can you tell the pregnant cow story?
The short version is 8 or 10 years ago, somebody called up the head of the ports in Eastport and said, can you handle shipping 100,000 pregnant cows to Turkey? And they said, sure. And so it's a long story. Essentially, after mad cow disease, Europe needed to restock its herd with with American cattle, but they wanted the cattle to be born in Europe, so they'd be European citizens, and they could run for president and everything. So the idea was cattle would be inseminated in Texas there by some company that was able to have only female calves. They'd be trucked, and then cowboys would drive them to Eastport, Maine. They'd be loaded onto ships, and they'd go to Turkey. And so this became their big business for quite a while.
And the point is, they just said yes to everything. I mean, that may be partly foolish, but optimistic that they'll figure out a way to do it once they say yes. The other thing, so in language, there's this little subfield called language engineering, where you actually change the language or try to change the language. It usually doesn't work because it has to actually be true or real for it to take root there. But in Eastport, there is this very strong little clique of women about my age in the town who wanted to change everything, and they noticed that every newspaper article was about Eastport, even if it was a good one, ended up with paragraphs saying Eastport, the town in decline or despair or deny. There were DE words always at the end of the paragraph. And so since they knew the newspaper editors in the town, they said, no more. You have to replace those D words with re words like reinvent, recapture, renew, revitalize. And they made them do that. They made them write into their newspaper articles all these rewords. The thing was that there was enough going on in that town that it made sense to people to use vocabulary that was positive in that way. So in that case, the language engineering absolutely worked, because it could work. Again, I'll say it usually doesn't work, but I think it is important to pay attention to the language that people use and to have positive people talking positive language.
And we're talking around your second question because we don't know how to answer that one.
This
is about how outside people could best give help.
Yeah, that is so hard, because I mean, you know the answer, which is just go and listen, because people who are there know best, and then try to help from what they say, because
different each place.
Different each place, but I think it's you can listen, and you can be good listeners, and you can understand finally in the heart of what people are recommending or saying in their towns, and maybe help with things that they haven't thought about as a way to do it. But I think being good listeners is the number one rule.
For all you funders, also keep funding people who are starting to win. Don't stop just as they get on the way up.
That's what we wish we had said, yes.
That's right, just keep funding. Chuck?
Hi guys, thanks for making time. I'm Chuck Shootman, and a question, James, as you were talking about some of the bigger challenges, and one of the points you made was this type of progress takes time. And in an era of instantaneous news, even shorter attention spans, and a world where we can, some talented folks can get on airplanes and fly 100,000 miles to discover the hearts of America. Did you see techniques or tools that can be used to help develop patience to see positive results?
That is another very interesting question, and yet another discovery for us as we've traveled around as newcomers to the whole world of civic development is how a number of these civic virtues do seem to be cultivatable and teachable traits, as opposed to something that a community has or doesn't. And there are external factors that make a difference. As a whole separate conversation, we're newly impressed by both the importance of local media and the challenges for local media right now. And I think if I had the ear of major funders, I would say that a place where today's funders could make some of the biggest civic difference is finding ways to help support local media, because it's so cheap. People in journalism don't cost that much money. I speak from experience, and that they you can do a lot with a few young reporters to keep these institutions going. But there are. I was, for example, in Pensacola, Florida last month, just before the hurricane hit. This Mexico City, or whatever what was the city that was Mexico City that was just to the Mexico Beach. So it was just to the east of it. Pensacola was largely spared, but Pensacola is essentially devoting itself to teaching civics among its population. They have a series of discussions called Civic Con. There's a guy named Quint Studer who has this textbook, sort of like the Orton Foundations, of how exactly you have checklists for success, many other foundations. And I think that in Sioux Falls, the Argus Leader, the newspaper there, had developed a combined video and sort of public meeting way of trying to develop a long-term timeline for that part of the state and what it was going to be. So I think that, yes, we found places where people thought consciously about how to build in the long-term view. Some places it was strong mayor systems where the mayor could be there for a couple decades. That's been the case in Riverside, California, and in Greenville and some other places. Others, they're termed out. But my short answer, the short version of a long answer is this seems to be a cultivatable skill, probably not at the national level for the foreseeable future, but localities can have enough offsets to the panic of cable news and of social media to find ways to have a counterweight.
One other thing that I just remembered about funding, this surprised me that a number of people from the National Endowment for the Arts were saying that one of their problems is that once they give funding to places, there isn't a kind of infrastructure and organization within that place that can actually follow through with the money they've just gotten, and they end up having to give the money back because nothing happened once it went there. I think that's, I don't know how typical that is, but, and certainly a lot of the foundations that we've seen, like the Orton Foundation, has a system in place so that won't happen, but it was surprising that we heard that just a few weeks ago. Yeah.
So I heard you say at some point that communities that you visited that were better at embracing immigrant communities, or that were more diverse and celebrated that diversity and valued inclusion, you felt were more successful?
We're better.
More successful, better. And I wondered if you saw themes, because it sounds like a lot of these places were pretty small places, and if you saw themes as to how these different communities, if it was natural to most of them that you went and visited, or was there work, and what did that look like to get those communities to the place where they are?
Yeah. The number of communities I can think of where there were sizable portions of refugees have been taking refugees for 30 or 40, since the Vietnam War, essentially. And they started out with strong religious organizations like Catholic Charities, Lutheran Services, that first said, yes, we'll take a few refugees, and they've just built on that. And they've built the connections with the school system, with sometimes there were big employers, like in Sioux Falls, it was the meat packing. In mostly not refugees, but immigrants in Dodge City, it was also meat packing, where people in town didn't want those jobs, and refugees were happy to get those jobs. But in Erie, Pennsylvania, and in Burlington, it was a scramble with the organizations to place people into the smaller companies where they might take 2 or 3 or 4 people to work there. And in those cases, I think it was a combination of a lot of hard work in helping the community understand the value of being inclusive and embracing people who are very different looking from them, addressing the problems they brought with their different cultures, and recognizing the assets that they brought. Like, these are great workers. They'll show up every day and we can trust them, which was how people in Burlington, Vermont talked about it when individual companies would take people. So I think it's a very long, complex job of having some leaders who can help build that community mindset that this will make us all better. And before you know it, after a while, people are starting to say, we are all better for this. Our town is thriving because of the refugees and what they bring to it, rather than they're draining us or we're sacrificing because of them. But that positive language comes out of the reality of the long process of education and experience and leadership.
And can I give a brief story to illustrate what Deb is talking about? So I think, as Deb was saying, faith organization played a really big role in this, and then especially if they can partner with some sort of civic leaders. A story that, did any of you see the story in the paper in the past 2 or 3 weeks about the polling place in Dodge City, Kansas, the way it was moved? This is the, to me, interesting backstory of that news in the past 2 or 3 weeks. So we spent a lot of time at Dodge City in the summer of 2016, and we argued that it was a successful illustration of sort of ethnic assimilation. Anybody here from Dodge City or Western Kansas? So what we observed there, you all know Dodge City from Gunsmoke. The business and political leadership of Dodge City is older white people. The population is slight majority Latino now from the meatpacking industry. The public school population is overwhelmingly Latino. So we were impressed, number one, that when Sam Brownback had his Kansas State school cutbacks for public schools in Kansas, the voters of Dodge City, overwhelmingly white and older, approved bond issues for the public schools where the kids were mainly Latino. And they were telling us this was because we all need to be together, et cetera. And there were other things they did which made us argue that even people who were very politically conservative thought that the welfare of Dodge City depended on what it was becoming. Then you saw the news of the polling place being moved north of town, away from the Latino centers of population. So we called up our friends there and said, what about this? This is not the face of the city we saw when we were there. And they said, you should understand the polling place has been moved by the county, which was under Chris Kobach's jurisdiction. So Chris Kobach, of course, Secretary of State running for governor, moved the polling place. And what the city council did the next day, the city council is 5 older white people, men and women. The city council, their reaction was to guarantee free door-to-door transportation for every voter in Dodge City to the new polling place. And the mayor, a guy sort of actuarially like me, an older white guy, but down the line Republican, put out a statement saying, we are proud of what Dodge City is becoming, and we want to guarantee the right of every one of our citizens to vote. So again, that was the kind of change we saw enough of to notice, coexisting with all of the racial burden that America has from its history and its present and its future. But that's the Dodge City story.
We have time for a couple more if anybody wants to come up. Let me ask one while somebody's thinking. We haven't talked a ton about the evolution of leadership in these communities. When we travel, we hear people all the time, we need leaders. It's mostly from the people you would assume are the leaders, but they talk about leadership. Is there change that you're seeing out there where all this energy is coming from?
We saw cities where they were trying to grow their own. Felt as if, again, it was a teachable skill to involve people as leaders. In Duluth, for example, it was the business leadership more, where the people who were in their 50s and 60s, the bankers and sort of established people there, were saying we need to find ways to engage people in their 30s and early 40s. And they had sort of systematic meetings to try to, you've probably been at some of those.
I think there are people in the room who are doing that right now, so
good.
It's okay.
Yes, and that there were similar things in the civic realm. many of you here probably have been to Eric Liu's Citizen University, and they're trying to teach that around the country. San Bernardino is very systematic. San Bernardino had been a place with essentially zero civic spirit. This is part of my homeland, so I can say that. And they're trying to grow it deliberately, both through the schools, through the churches, and through the city government. So yes, we saw a number of ways where people were trying to promote this.
And sometimes it just pops out where you'd least expect it. You know, a teacher, or, well, you might expect it from teachers, but the town historian or some old guy or some, group of 4 baby boomer women, where you might least expect it. So, but those were the natural, organic ones.
Joe, you get the last one from the audience.
Sorry, I was trying to sneak up while you were talking, but you bring something to the table that's very unique. Everywhere you go, you get to be a clean slate. You get to have a fresh perspective on everything that you see, which is beautiful. My guess will be some of the communities that you visited have that learned behavior, that learned cultural expectation. Talking about growing your own, are we now looking toward the younger generation, 24 and under, to come back to the workforce conversation, to be that magnet, to be that attractor for, success begets success? Is that what we're looking at now in the communities you're seeing?
Yeah, I think so. A lot of people, so you talk about Redlands or Bend or others. So Bend now seems almost too successful to even be, realistic as an example, but it wasn't always that way. 25 years ago, it had extremely high unemployment. The timber industry fell apart, and we met people there who had recruited others who were their contemporaries to say, this is a great place where we want to be. I know that's happening in Redlands. I know it's happening in Sioux Falls. I know it's happening in other places. In Allentown, they are too. So yes, I think that attractive force. Before turning it over to Deb, here's a question I'm going to ask all of you. Actually, before we break up here, it'll be a show of hands. Those of you who buy our basic premise that there is a locally based positive movement growing up, versus those of you who buy the sort of American carnage premise that it's even worse.
All of you who have American carnage, raise your hand.
Yes. Yeah. How many of you think it's even worse than you think?
Raise your hand if you actually see optimism out there in your communities. It's there. Okay. All right. Everybody who raised their hand, they have to buy them a drink tonight. It'll work out well.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I think one problem with this that we heard in most towns is that, along with being young people who are in a position to do all this stuff, they're so busy because you've got the little kids, and they can't go out to meetings at night, so maybe they're not joining the traditional groups in the town. But we saw them working in different ways, and we saw them being mentored by, not necessarily going to meetings, but in Duluth, it's a good example. The bankers and the founding fathers and the kind of establishment of Duluth deliberately said, we need these new young people who are doing startups or starting new businesses. Let's give them a favorable loan, or let's get them this place they can rent, to extend beyond kind of normal channels because they believed in them and because they believed in the future of the town that way. So I think that the young people are coming there and working within what they do. Maybe it's more at the schools or in the parks and recreation or taking part. Certainly we see that with our own kids. I think maybe they're not on the library board yet because they got to be home helping their kids. But it is an issue that we saw a lot of the older people in the towns really trying to pay attention to. Is we're not going to be around forever, so how do we encourage this change? Yeah.
And real estate differential costs are a big attraction for bringing in the young people. And also, I think it is becoming sort of hip to think of other places where you can make a difference.
So I want to finish up with you offering some advice. We have to figure out the next 24 hours some things we want to do. So about half this room are people going to go home on Wednesday and try to make their communities better. and the other half are going to try to help figure out how to do that, how to fund that, how to get all these people together to do that. So advice for either group?
I thought you were going to say the other half are going to try to make their communities worse.
No, not in this group. We're going to start, I'll stall while you're thinking. We're going to start a t-shirt thing for Home of Future Thinking. We're going to have one that says non-subdued excitement, one that says no to American carnage, and then one that, what was the what was that one?
The phantasmagorical nightmare scene, the famous screen pin.
Okay, so we're going to get, t-shirts coming. That's
Yes.
how we do it. All right, advice. That was it. That was my style for you.
For the funders, I guess, it'd be crazy for us to presume to tell you anything you don't know since this is your profession, but I guess to be emboldened by the fact that from the outside, it looks like you have tremendous leverage. It looks as if things are starting to move. There's a boulder that's beginning to be pushed or rolled or whatever, and so it takes, you can continue the effort, and that the arenas of maximum positive leverage in the short or medium term seem to be these local level reforms, engagement, positive spirit. I'll talk about the specific issue of the workforce and then just larger issue of largeness. On workforce, this seems like, I'll give this additional sentence of history. The millennia of American history I've lived through and all the rest of it that I've studied gives me the lesson that every single decade in American history brings its very severe economic dislocation. Some more than others. This is a pretty severe one over the last 10 years, but it's not the worst America has had. I bet every family in this room, if you think back 2 or 3 generations, you know your family story is of some profound economic dislocation. Certainly mine is. And that there is, so that's been sort of the bad economic trauma of the last generation. But it seems as if there's really surprisingly positive opportunity in this apprenticeship, career technical training, community college, workforce connection. There are these new job opportunities that are opening up, and there are people who need those opportunities. And so the ability to make that connection is really important for funders. I think we should do it. My sense of economic dislocation is that eventually it works out through brute force. Eventually people who are driven off the farm, their grandchildren will find a job. But sometimes it happens in really cruel ways like the Dust Bowl, and sometimes it happens in better ways like the GI Bill. And you all have the opportunity to try to help create something like the GI Bill, of matching people who need opportunities with the opportunities that are coming up. So I would be encouraged to the funders that this is a brightening moment of some leverage.
Final word.
2 little things that we saw work that surprised me. One was surveys of local townspeople, actual, do you like this, do you not like this, what would you like changed? In Bend, Oregon, the director of the library came new to town and said, I got to see what the people think of the library. So they did a survey of people in town, and he found no one thought anything of the library. They just had no familiarity with it whatsoever. So he sent out all his librarians in a very Tocquevillian way to make connections with the Rotary Club, the Community Foundation, the Goodwill Industries, to see what would come of these associations in town. Now the Deschutes Public Libraries are roaring successes for little things they learned along the way like that. Open the library an hour earlier in the daytime so the old people can be bussed in from the nursing homes and have the library in peace and quiet to themselves, because they never came before. They were too disrupted. But so a survey is one thing that surprised me. The other thing is embed the operations of your town with artists. We saw this in a number of places. An artist in the planning department in Minneapolis, St. Paul, they just have different perspectives on what is a civic issue in town and how do you address it. And sometimes they fail fast, it's a weird idea and it didn't work, but sometimes they don't, and they manage to bring in families or kids or whoever to be part of this civic dialogue that actually makes some relevant change happen. So I think those, like, try anything, try everything.
Another T-shirt, try anything. We are not Sisyphus with a rock, and we're going to work on it. Let's thank them for being with us today.